It is the breakthrough 42 years in the making. A Galveston County grand jury has finally issued indictments in the infamous Texas killing fields investigation.
It was for years that one man has been the face of the search for the truth. We're talking about Tim Miller.
On the evening of September 10th, 1984, a 16-year-old girl stood at a payphone outside a convenience store in League City, Texas. Her family had just moved to town, and the home phone hadn't been connected yet, so her mother had driven her to the store to call her boyfriend. She made the call. She hung up the receiver. The walk home was half a mile, a routine errand on an unremarkable suburban evening. She told her mother she would walk it. She never made it back. 11 months earlier, another woman had vanished from the same payphone. Laura Miller's body was found in that same field 17 months later. 2 more bodies turned up there. The case stayed open for 42 years while her father worked it. By 2026, the man he suspected was dead. The man who would face charges was someone Laura's father had been listening to for years. Laura Lynn Miller was a sophomore at Clear Creek High School. She was musically gifted and had been in the choir. Then debilitating seizures forced her to miss too much school. The medication kept the seizures under control. It could not bring back what they had cost her. League City sits about 28 miles southeast of Houston, between Interstate 45 and the Gulf Coast. In 1984, it was a small town of strip malls and ranch houses spread thin along the highway. The Miller family had just settled into a new home there. Tim Miller worked as a general contractor. His wife, Georgian, ran the house. Laura was their teenage daughter, adjusting to a new school. What none of them knew that evening was that the same payphone had been used by another young woman a year earlier. Heidi Fye was a 25-year-old bartender who lived with her parents 3 blocks from where the Millers had just moved in. She worked at a club called the Texas Moon. On the night of October 10th, 1983, she had used the payphone outside that convenience store and was never seen alive again. A dog carried her skull home to its owner the following April. The skull had come from an oil field off Calder Road. The Millers had no idea about any of this when they moved in. The store owner remembered her. He had seen her come in, use the payphone, and walk out, and noticed nothing in her behavior that struck him as off. She started up the road toward home. The walk should have taken 10 minutes. The road ran through a residential stretch with houses set back from the curb behind shallow front yards. Streetlights were sparse. It was September, so the light was fading by early evening, but not yet dark when Laura started walking. She had walked the route before. Tim Miller arrived home that evening with her boyfriend and her mother. The house was empty. The doors had not been opened. Nothing inside suggested Laura had come back and gone out again, just the empty house, and a daughter who had said she would walk half a mile and instead had walked into nothing. The Miller family started calling around immediately. They tried the convenience store, friends from school, the boyfriend's house, the police. Laura's boyfriend, who had been waiting at the house for her arrival, drove the route between the store and the house, looking for any sign of her, and found nothing along the road. Tim Miller drove the side streets. The sun went down on a Monday in September. Laura had been gone for hours by then, and the family had nothing. Whatever had happened between the receiver and the front door had left no trail anyone could follow. By the next morning, the family had widened the search to teachers, friends, anyone who might have seen her. Tim made his first trip back to the convenience store at first light to walk the route his daughter would have taken. The road was a normal stretch of suburban pavement, with no shoulder, no witnesses, and no answers. He walked it a second time that evening, and a third time the day after that, and after a week, he stopped counting how many times he had walked it. The League City Police Department took the report. The detective assigned to the case looked at a teenage girl who had failed to come home from a phone call. He classified her as a runaway, and the classification became the file's permanent designation. A runaway gets posters and a phone number to call. A missing person gets canvassing and witness interviews. A suspected abduction gets the FBI. Laura Miller got the lowest tier of attention from the day she vanished. Tim Miller rejected the runaway theory immediately. He knew his daughter had not left voluntarily. Tim pushed back on the department and told them about Heidi Fye. 2 young women, 1 small town, the same payphone, both vanished into the same 5-mile stretch of road. Tim asked them to look at the patch of land where Heidi's body had been found. The department brushed it aside. 2 cases, 2 women. The list of parallels stayed in Tim Miller's notebook. Tim drove out to the Calder Road tract himself, in the months after Laura disappeared, and walked the scrub with friends and a few volunteers from his contracting work. Nothing turned up. He came home and started keeping his own notes on a daughter the official file had already written off. Names of people who had known her, places she might have gone, possible connections to other missing women in the area. The file said runaway. The file controlled what happened next. And what happened next was almost nothing. 17 months later, on February 2nd, 1986, 2 boys were riding dirt bikes through the brush near the 3,000 block of Calder Road. They smelled something rotten and figured it was a dead animal. They walked over to look anyway. The body they found had been there about 2 months. She was naked, propped against a tree, with a small caliber bullet through her back that had severed her spine. She carried no identification and matched no missing person report in the county. Investigators assigned her a placeholder name, Jane Doe. When the police arrived to process the scene, they found a second skeleton 60 feet away. This one had been there much longer. The remains were identified through dental records that afternoon. Laura Miller had been lying in that field, 4 miles from the payphone, for almost a year and a half. The field itself was an abandoned 25-acre oil patch, the ground marshy in places and choked with brush, dirt roads cutting through tall weeds. No houses overlooked it. No streetlights touched it. Heidi Fye's body had been recovered from the same field 2 years earlier, in the months after the dog brought the skull home. 3 women in one stretch of brush. 2 of them found within 60 feet of each other on a February afternoon. A 4th body turned up 5 years later. On September 8, 1991, passers-by spotted another body off Calder Road. Another woman with no identification, dead about 6 weeks. Her upper spine crushed. Investigators called her Janet Doe. The locals already had a name for the area by then. Beyond Calder Road, the broader stretch of Interstate 45 between Houston and Galveston had been collecting bodies since the 1970s. Roughly 30 women, most of them young, most of them never connected to any one perpetrator. Reporters dubbed the stretch the Highway to Hell. The locals called the field by something blunter, the Texas Killing Fields. The 4 bodies off Calder Road were the tightest cluster in that broader stretch. They sat together in the same brush, on the same dirt road within sight of each other on the map. The pattern pointed to a single mind, or a small group that kept coming back to the same ground. Investigators had been treating the field as a single case since the second body was recovered in 1986. 40 years later, they were still treating it that way. Tim Miller had a suspect early, a man who lived 2 streets over from the Millers' previous home, the one they'd left when they moved into League City. He was a roofer who worked construction jobs around Galveston County and drank at the same bars Heidi Fye worked. A few years older than Tim. His rap sheet read like a casting call: trespassing, theft, attempted arson, sexual assault, enticing a child, aggravated kidnapping, terroristic threats. The entries stretched back through the 1970s. By September 1984, his record had been collecting entries for 15 years. None of them had cost him more than a few months at a stretch. He was a free man that night. He had been a free man almost every day of his adult life. In July 1984, 2 months before Laura disappeared, a 29-year-old woman named Ellen Ray Beeson left a League City bar called the Texas Moon with him. She told her friends she was going swimming with the man she'd just met. Her body was found later, dumped on a roadside in Galveston County under debris and trash. He told police she had drowned, and he had panicked and hidden her. The medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death. The 1984 autopsy did not look closely at her skull. He was convicted of abuse of a corpse and sentenced to a year in jail. In 2011, his ex-wife went to the Galveston County District Attorney. She told prosecutors that he had said things over the years about Beeson that didn't match the story of an accidental drowning. The district attorney's office exhumed the body. A second examination found severe skull fractures, consistent with a blow to the back of the head. In 2014, 28 years after Ellen Beeson died, he was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 20 years in prison. His name was Clyde Edwin Hedrick. Hedrick served 8 years of his 20-year sentence. He was released in October 2021 to mandatory supervision at a Houston halfway house, a short drive from the League City neighborhood where Laura Miller had grown up. While Hedrick was in prison, an inmate told investigators that Hedrick had bragged about killing 4 or 5 women, naming Laura Miller and Heidi Fye among them. The investigators couldn't corroborate the statement. In Texas, a jailhouse confession alone cannot carry a conviction. The brag went into the file. Hedrick finished his sentence and walked. Tim had filed his civil suit for the wrongful death of Laura Miller in 2014. It was the same year Hedrick was convicted in the Beeson case, and the suit sat on the docket through the 8 years he served. In July 2022, 10 months after Hedrick walked out of prison, a Galveston County judge entered judgment against him by default. Hedrick had not appeared for the hearing. The amount came to $24,365,471. The civil court could not put Hedrick in prison, but for the first time in 38 years, a court had attached his name to Laura Miller's death. No criminal prosecutor had been willing to do that. After Laura's body was found, Tim worked her case the only way he knew how. He pulled paperwork from courthouses. He drove to neighboring counties to interview people the police had not. He wrote letters to prosecutors who didn't write back. The man he believed had killed Laura was somewhere in Galveston County, going about his life. The state had decided otherwise. In August 2000, 16 years after Laura disappeared, Tim founded Texas EquiSearch. The name came from the horseback teams that ran the early searches across pastures and brushland that police helicopters could not cover. The organization grew. By the time Tim filed the civil suit against Hedrick, EquiSearch had worked more than 2,000 cases. They had brought 428 missing people home alive. They had recovered the remains of 326. Tim never stopped working Laura's case. The notes he had started in 1984 kept growing. Not for a year. Not for a decade. Not for 42 years. He worked the Calder Road field alongside law enforcement when they would have him, and on his own when they wouldn't. In 2016, the League City Police Department learned about a Virginia company called Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon had developed a technique called snapshot DNA phenotyping. It could read genetic markers off old samples and generate a composite of what the person had looked like in life. The department submitted samples from Jane Doe and Janet Doe. The composites came back in May 2016 and May 2017. They didn't produce a name on their own, but they gave investigators something to work with. In April 2018, the department started building family trees through a public genealogy database called GEDmatch. An FBI agent named Richard Renison offered access to Family Tree DNA, a larger database. The investigators worked the matches backward through birth records and marriage certificates. On January 29, 2019, the results came back. Jane Doe was Audrey Lee Cook, born in Memphis, Tennessee on November 25, 1955, a mechanic. Last seen by her family in December 1985, 3 months before her body turned up in the field. Janet Doe was Donna Gonsoulin Prudhomme, born in Port Arthur, Texas on April 23, 1957, a mother of 2. Last seen in July 1991, 6 weeks before her body was found. Cook's family had been waiting 33 years to learn what had happened to her. Prudhomme's family had waited 27. In April 2022, the same spring Tim Miller won his civil judgment. A man from Backcliff reached out and said he had things to say. He was Hedrick's age and had known Hedrick for decades. He told Tim he wanted to get some weight off his chest. Tim agreed to meet. The man started talking. He knew details about the Calder Road killings that had never been released to the public. He knew where bodies had been placed, how they had been positioned, what had been done to them. On one of their early drives out to the field, the man asked Tim to stop the car. "We dumped something right there," he said, looking out the window. Tim looked at the ground. The spot was the exact location where Laura had been found. On a different drive, the man took Tim past a house in their old neighborhood. Hedrick had lived there, the man said, in the early 1980s. The Millers had lived 2 doors down. The man Tim had been suspecting for almost 40 years had lived 2 doors down from his daughter. Over the next 3 years, the two men met 20 or 30 times. They drove the back roads. They sat at restaurants. They walked through fields. The man from Baycliff told Tim things that fit with everything Tim already knew, and things Tim had never heard. He gave names of women Tim hadn't connected to Hedrick before. He gave details of trips that nobody outside the inner circle would have known about. Tim had no reason at the time to doubt that this was a witness, a former friend of Hedrick's who had carried a load too heavy to keep carrying. Every conversation made it feel more true. "You don't think this guy could be involved," Tim later told reporters. "You're thinking, here's somebody who wants to help." What the man from Backcliff was actually doing was harder to admit out loud. He had been there. The vial of cocaine he had prepared in a lethal dose had gone from his hand to Hedrick's hand to the inside of Laura Miller on the evening of September 10th, 1984. He had helped dump her body in the field, and Audrey Cook's body in the same field a year and a half later. Some of what he was telling Tim was a witness account. The rest was something else. When Kenneth Cusick took office as Galveston County District Attorney in October 2025, he inherited a task force that had been quietly assembling for over a year. Chief Assistant District Attorney Kate Willis was running it. The FBI had assigned Richard Renison, the same agent who had handled the genetic genealogy in 2019. Galveston County Sheriff's deputies were at the table. So were the League City detectives who had carried the file from the beginning. They had decades of evidence and the running record of what the Backcliff source had been telling Tim Miller for nearly 4 years. Old evidence boxes had been pulled from county storage. Witness statements from the 1980s had been reread. The investigators sifted through that material until they had a case they believed would survive a grand jury. By the beginning of 2026, the office was preparing 4 murder indictments against Hedrick, 1 for Heidi Fye, 1 for Audrey Cook, 1 for Donna Prudhomme. The 4th, for Laura Miller, would be capital murder. A Galveston County detective sat down with Hedrick in early March to interview him about the Calder Road cases. He didn't admit to anything. A short time later, Hedrick complained of breathing trouble. On Friday, March 20th, he was admitted to a Houston hospital and placed on a ventilator. On Saturday, March 21st, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he removed it himself. He was 72 years old. He died before any of the indictments could be filed. Within hours of the hospital notifying the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the prosecution team had a choice to make. They had spent over a year building a case against Hedrick. Hedrick was now dead. They decided to go to the grand jury anyway, with both files. The one against Hedrick would never produce a conviction. The one against his friend still could. They let a serial killer die peacefully in his damn bed when they had everything in front of them, Tim Miller told reporters. "I'm pretty angry." On March 31st, 2026, 10 days after Hedrick's death, the grand jury returned an indictment on 3 felony counts: manslaughter in the death of Laura Miller, felony tampering with evidence for the disposal of Laura Miller's body, felony tampering with evidence for the disposal of Audrey Lee Cook's body. The defendant was 61 years old and lived in a house on 18th Street in Backcliff. His name was James Dolphs Elmore, Jr. Elmore was arrested the same day and booked into the Galveston County Jail. A magistrate denied his initial bond. Bond was later set at $1.5 million. The trial date was scheduled for August 24, 2026. On April 1st, District Attorney Cusick stood at a podium inside the Galveston County Commissioner's Court building on Moody Avenue in downtown Galveston. Kate Willis stood beside him. The audience behind them filled with people in yellow Texas EquuSearch shirts. Tim Miller was in the front row. Cusick announced the indictment of Elmore and confirmed the office had been preparing capital murder charges against Hedrick when he died 11 days earlier. He said the broader Killing Fields investigation remained open. Due to the concerted efforts of the law enforcement agencies in this county, Cusick told the room, this 40-year cycle of violence by these defendants against women, we're trying to make headway on it. Heidi Fye's niece, Nina Yeager, spoke after the press conference. She had spent her entire adult life waiting for an answer that finally arrived too late. It's sad that Clyde didn't get to pay for what he did, on one hand, she said. On the other hand, she said, she was glad he no longer breathed the same air as the families he had destroyed. Tim Miller spoke too. He told the reporters he had probably met Elmore 20 or 30 times over the previous 4 years and had trusted him the whole way. The conversations meant something different now. Tim kept running them back in his head. Was he telling me what he did? Tim asked. I trusted him. I really did. 6 days before the indictment came down, Elmore had told Tim that a body might be buried on his property in Backcliff. He hadn't said whose. On April 16th, 2 search warrants were served on Elmore's Backcliff property. The first looked for human remains in the soil around the house. The second looked for digital evidence on devices already seized during the arrest. Cadaver dogs walked the yard. Investigators worked the ground. No remains were recovered. The phone investigators had taken off Elmore the night they arrested him contained images of child sexual abuse. On May 1st, 2 additional felony charges were filed. Elmore's combined bond rose to $4.5 million. He remained in the Galveston County Jail through the spring, awaiting trial. The 4-decade pattern Calder Road represented was not assumed to end with one defendant. I'm almost 80 years old, Tim Miller told the reporters. I'm going to stick around and face James Elmore in a courtroom. I'm going to do that. The payphone outside the convenience store is gone now. So is the convenience store. The field off Calder Road is greener than it was, and a local church has placed markers at the spots where the 4 women were found. Tim Miller built a wooden cross at the spot where 2 boys on dirt bikes found his daughter. 42 years after Laura walked toward home, he still goes there. If this case stayed with you, leave your thoughts in the comments. More solved cases in the playlist.